Hi, Scott Dreyer here at Dreyer Coaching, and part two of our little book story, Checkmate in Berlin by Giles Milton, and also an overview of some of that crucial turning point between the end of World War II and the start of the Cold War. So let's have a few little images here to help us get started. Actually, a little bit of a review. So first off, the book began in February 45. Even though the book is about Berlin, the book's hook was with the so-called Yalta Conference in February 45. Here's the Crimean Peninsula. This is the Soviet Union. That's the Black Sea. And here in the peninsula, you've got Yalta is here. Oh, and by the way, I did some research. I can't quite find why this is, but it was really very difficult. Either the conference was at Yalta. Again, Stalin was afraid to fly. So that made Churchill and Roosevelt travel very far, which is unfair to them. Roosevelt, we know, is dying because the conference was in February. He died in April. Actually, Churchill was about 70 years old. And I didn't realize this, but he actually became Prime Minister of England at age 65 in the spring of 40, when the world realized that what was called the appeasement policy was a failure. More about that, look up the Munich Treaty if you're curious about appeasement and Neville Chamberlain. And so if Churchill was 65 when the war began, he would have been about age 70 at this point. And we live in an age today where people travel a lot. You know, my best friend from college days, will marry, he's flying to Zimbabwe as we speak. Okay, so nowadays world travel is very common. In the 40s, it was still quite unusual. And so this is very, very demanding for Roosevelt and Churchill to fly this far. Furthermore, I'm not quite sure why this is, but at least at that time, there was no airfield, no airport in Yalta, at least not a functioning one. So they flew to a place called Saki, which is actually a 6-hour drive. So imagine how grueling it would be to fly, in Churchill's case, from England for Roosevelt to cross the Atlantic Ocean, and you're already ill or in poor health, and you land, and then you have 6 hours of drive across these mountains. So that's why they were driving, the snowy mountains there to get to Yalta. And this is one of the most famous pictures of the big three: Stalin, Roosevelt, Churchill at Yalta in February 1945. And this map shows kind of the status of World War II at that time. The purple area was Soviet occupied. They were liberating from the Nazis, but more or less exchanging one dictatorship for the other. In Poland, they had a kind of a gallows humor joke. The Poles say World War II is the only war we lost twice, meaning we lost it the first time in 39 when the Nazis took over, and we lost again in 44, 45 when the Russians drove the Germans out, but then they had their own dictatorship for more than 40 years. So the Poles say World War II is the war that our country lost twice. So by early 45, the time of this Yalta conference, Hitler more or less controlled this gray area. The Russians had this, the Allies, the Western Allies, England, Canada, US, more or less had this area. So closing like a huge vice, like a huge nutcracker in on the Nazis. Now, while they're meeting at Yalta, one of the biggest issues was, what do we do with Germany? And when you look at history, you can't look at it from your own time frame. You have to go back in that time frame. So in the mindset of world leaders in 45, the thinking was, Germany has more or less caused 2 world wars in our lifetime. We can't have a world war every 20 years caused by the Germans. We need to change the dynamic already, redo things so we don't have a World War III in 1965. And the first plan was to dismember Germany and cut it into 4 pieces. In other words, each of the victorious powers would get a chunk. So Germany will be divided into 4 zones. And the initial goal was for this division to be temporary until Germany could be denazified, get the Nazism out of its culture, and put back on a more democratic footing. Many allies thought that Germany should never again have industry. That should be just a bunch of farmers and, goat herders, but thinking that a farming country can never wage war again. So if you look at the map, because the Soviets were coming in from the east, and even here, I learned this actually today in my research, the Normandy beaches are here. The Brits and Canadians had the more eastern and northern beaches. The Americans had the more southern western beaches, and that pattern continued. So the British Army went more to the north of Germany, the American Army more to the south. And you see that reflected here. As Germany was to be divided, the Russians were to get the eastern part of Germany, because that's by the Soviet Union and Poland. The British would get the northern part, the Americans the southern part. In fact, it was at Potsdam the issue was raised, well, should France get a part? And at first, Stalin said they should not. And the Americans and Brits said, well, France really should have a section. And so Stalin went ahead and he gave in, said, okay, France can have a section, but he was very, very clever, very shrewd. He said, but if France gets a section, take it out of your part. In other words, he was not willing to lose any Russian territory to give to France. The thought was, okay, America, England, if you want to make your part smaller to give France a part, be my guest. But none of the French area will come out of our territory. Notice what's also ironic is that because Berlin was the capital, notice that Berlin is deep inside Russian territory. That'll be crucial coming on later. Also, the thing I learned today, I was looking at this map, I thought, wait a minute, why is there a little orange speck? Is that a typo or something? In fact, it's accurate. I either had not known this or had forgotten it. But even though the American zone was here, this is the British zone, the Americans also occupied Bremen. Now, if you know your children's nursery rhymes, maybe you've heard of the Bremertown or Bremertown musicians, the donkey and the rooster and the dog that go around and they find the thieves and get the money and scare them and stuff. That's the same town, Bremen. Because the American zone here was landlocked. This is Czechoslovakia, this is the Alps mountains, no ocean access. And so the American military planners really wanted to have access to a deep water port. Bremen's on the Weser River, and it's Germany's second biggest port in the north. Hamburg is Germany's biggest port. You can see Hamburg is clearly in the British zone, so that was British. And therefore, early on, it was decided that Bremen, even though it's inside the British zone, would be an American enclave, American possession, as it were, occupied zone, so that Americans could have their goods being shipped in and out. Now, France, this zone is also landlocked, but it's next door to France. So you simply drive down the road and cross the border back and forth. For the Brits, they had to have things go by ocean or by air. For the Americans, it was more landlocked. And there's the Russian zone. So not only was, also little known fact, not only was Germany divided into 4 zones, so was Austria. And also little known fact, Hitler was not German. Hitler was from Austria. At a time was called the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But he spoke German, was culturally more or less German. So it's amazing to think that not only did the German people, who were very well educated and had the world's highest number of Nobel Prize winners at the time, had world-class science, the world's best universities, the world's highest literacy rate, the Germans voluntarily gave their country over to this madman. And not only that, he was a madman, he was a foreigner. He was not even a German. He was from Austria. That alone is an amazing thing to think about, and how in a few years he brainwashed almost the whole country. So Germany was divided into 4 zones. Austria also was divided into 4 zones, little known fact. But in the case of Austria, the zones were united much more quickly. They didn't have near the drama that Germany experienced. And moreover, Austria's not as big in area, not as big politically, not as big militarily, didn't have the guilt that Germany had for World War II. And so Austria was a much different case post-war than Germany was. So at Yalta, the decision was Germany is divided into 4 pieces. But there's more to it, in fact. Not only would Germany be divided into 4 pieces, but also Berlin. Here's again is the zones. Since Berlin is here, the city of Berlin would also be cut into 4 zones, kind of mirroring the other aspect. You had the Russians get the eastern side, Americans the south, British the west. In this case, the French got the northern part. So this is significant. You've got the country cut into 4 occupation zones with soldiers there of the victorious powers, but also the capital is actually quite large. Back in the 1920s, there had been a new drawing of the boundaries. Actually, Berlin was not only the city, but also had a lot of the environs. It had, you know, lakes, parks, forests. It's more than just an urban core. It was actually quite huge. And so Berlin city also would be cut into 4 zones. That little chunk there, this is called Mitte or Stadtmitte, the actual downtown. And so the Russians were lucky that not only did they have, you know, a good chunk of the city, but when they drew the lines, they got that downtown, you know, the urban historic core of the city as well. Another little thing I learned from the book I'd never heard before, but when the Allies at Potsdam and Yalta had drawn these lines, they arranged to let the Allies, there's gonna be one Autobahn, one highway from here to Berlin near Hanover, and also I believe it was one railroad to connect with Berlin. But actually along that Autobahn, by agreement, every 25 miles, there was a gas station. The Allies, so even though this Autobahn, this highway went through communist occupied territory, every 25 miles, there was a gas station. So for Allied truck drivers or tanks or anybody going back and forth, if they had need to get gas or oil or flat tire fixed or whatever, every 25 miles there was an Allied owned and operated gas station. That didn't last too long. Pretty early on, the Russians put pressure around them, had barbed wire around them, lights. And so within a year or two, that was not successful. And the Allies pulled those little gas stations out. So it's almost like the same way West Berlin was an island inside communism, these little gas stations were even tiny little islands strung along this highway, but those ended up being cleared out later on. Okay, so let's go ahead and read a little bit here about the book. Back to the book again. And so as the Allies were meeting, Stalin was planning, you know, how to take over this. He agreed to have free elections, but Stalin clearly wanted Germany to become all communist. And there were some German communists who had fled Germany and went to Moscow during World War II. If they had stayed in Germany, they probably would have been executed, because Hitler he wanted the only party to be the Nazi party. And so these communists had fled to Moscow. This is actually page 32 in the book. So in the spring of 45, there's a hotel called Hotel Lux in Moscow on Gorky Street. The hotel became the headquarters of Moscow's Berlin Group, a secretive band of German-born revolutionaries supported by Stalin. They were charged with infiltrating themselves into the German capital within hours of the Red Army's capturing it. So Stalin was an evil genius. He was planning what to do. We're not going to let things go to chance. Once our soldiers take over, you know, these secretive Germans will sneak in to help make it communist. The idea was, who better to make Germany communist than German people? Not Russians, but German people. Once there, they had 2 important roles to play, one official and one very unofficial. The official role was benign, which means harmless, to root out the remnants of Nazism and lay the groundwork for a new and democratic system of government. Sounds good. And the denazification of Germany was an important issue. How do you unbrainwash these millions of people? The unofficial role was more nefarious. In the words of the group leader, Walter Ulbricht, it's got to look democratic, but we must have everything in our control. He intended to outwit the Western Allies by seizing control of the city's institutions, including the Berlin police. Quote, the best thing will be for us to divide ourselves up and each take over a particular district in Berlin. He told his group at a planning session, "We can then meet in the evenings and each report on his district." Ulbricht's team was to be helped in its work by some of the brightest stars in the Soviet military, generals whose medal-bedecked chests were evidence, though, that they were accustomed to winning. And so Walter Ulbricht was the eminence grise of this little band. A communist to his fingertips, he had impeccable revolutionary credentials. He had fled to the Soviet capital 8 years earlier when life in Hitler's Germany grew too tight for comfort, and he was soon smuggling anti-Nazi agents back into Berlin. In Moscow, Ulbricht became known as Comrade Cell on account of his gift for organizing networks of underground agents. So it's interesting. Look at the sneakiness of communism. Their official role for these guys was, oh, we're here to denazify and get the city running and police, whatever. But the unofficial was very much make it look democratic, but it's not. And today in the US, many people are concerned about democracy in our country. And things may appear democratic, their elections or whatever, but what's happening under the scene, behind the scenes, what's happening under the surface. Many are concerned about that. Also, it's interesting, his goal was to seize control of these institutions, including the police. And many today, looking at the US, we're concerned, what are institutions, what's happening in, in the media, higher education, K-12 education. It seems like a lot of these institutions are not very, shall we say, responsive to public opinion or the will of the public who's paying the taxes for it. So it's interesting that the communists, even in 1945, their goal was going to Berlin and in a very sneaky way, take over. Let's keep going here. So this is here about these German communists who've been in Moscow 8 years. They're going back. So on Friday, April 27th, 1945, the Berlin group was summoned to a meeting in Walter Ulbricht's second floor bedroom at the Hotel Lux. He told them his departure for Berlin was imminent. They are ready to fly to the German capital in the next few days. Everything ready? He asked each one in turn. Everything completed? He next turned to the practicalities of the mission, providing details about transport and money. He opened his briefcase and took out a bundle of banknotes, which he distributed. He has 1,000 rubles each as pocket money. That was a large sum. And so he was giving them money to get started. More about Walter Ulbricht. Some questioned if Ulbricht was the right man for a mission that would require charm and charisma. Attired in his shapeless suit of a party apparatchik, Ulbricht was chillingly deficient in both. "I seldom saw him laugh," said one in his circle, "and I do not remember ever having detected any sign of personal feelings." Another concluded he was not a nice man. He was a tireless weaver of intrigues. This intriguing had left Ulbricht a loner. From his school days onward, he never had a single personal friend. He had managed to acquire himself a wife known as Comrade Lottie, but she was loathed by everyone at the Hotel Lux. Ulbricht had the dogmatic asceticism of a desert monastic. I just love this writer. What a great writer. He didn't drink, didn't socialize, didn't eat meat or fish. His mealtime preference was for raw vegetables, a dietary regime that even his most diehard comrades found hard to stomach. According to one, quote, "He never gave cocktail parties, never had affairs, and even gave up smoking as a drain on his revolutionary activities. When he spoke, he did in a curiously high-pitched voice, dispensing revolutionary wisdom in his sing-song Saxon dialect. His judgment was final and irrevocable. He had the last word always, interrupting everybody and heckling speakers he dislikes. He was the prototype for so many future leaders of Eastern Europe, grim, ashen-faced, and entirely devoid of humor." Okay, so that's the Ulbricht guy, the German communist coming in to take over. Okay, so we go on to April of, this is going to be April of 45. Because Berlin is near the eastern side of Germany, the Russians were there first. So you have a dead German soldier here. And it was very important for propaganda purposes that the Russians be first to Berlin. And even people kind of debate, it seemed like, well, not it seemed like it was, Eisenhower was telling the Americans kind of slow down, let the Russians get there first. Some Americans were very eager to get to Berlin quickly, like a guy named Frank Howley, the colonel. But for political reasons or whatever, Eisenhower put the brakes on it. The Russians were first there. And here you have the very iconic picture. The Russians knew the propaganda value of photographs. You may know that famous picture of the U.S. Marines raising the flag on Iwo Jima. That was not staged. It happened to be the photographers there at the right place at the right time. In this case, it was heavily staged because the Russians knew the value of that Marine flag raising on Iwo Jima, and they would have a similar scene at what's called the Reichstag. It was like the German Parliament building. And so the photographer had to go back and I have his uncle, who was a tailor in Moscow, get a red tablecloth and stitch this yellow hammer and sickle on it. And these volunteers scrambled the top and hung their Russian flag. And within hours, this picture was sent around the world. It later, though, had to be edited because this soldier here has 2 watches. You can't see very clearly, but he had 2 watches on him. Clearly, he had been looting watch stores. And the Russians thought, that's probably not real good for image to show this guy. He's a looter with 2 watches. So one was later taken out of the picture. For more about that, look at a good book called The Vanishing Commissar, about how the Soviets could just erase and change history by changing photographs. So very iconic picture of the Russians taking over Berlin. So at exactly 6 a.m. on the last day of April, a bus pulled up outside the side doors of the Hotel Lux in Moscow. It had come to collect Walter Ulbricht's group of revolutionaries and take them to Moscow airport, from where a military plane would carry them to Berlin. The wind blasted Moscow streets were deserted at such an early hour, but the city was already decorated in preparation for the upcoming festivities. The following day, May Day, and shops were bedecked with flags, bunting, and political slogans. As leader of the Berlin group, Walter Ulbricht knew exactly what was to be done upon their arrival in the German capital. We had worked out all the details, he said, from setting up the administration to the organization of culture. Wolfgang Leonhardt, the youngest member of the group, felt a surge of excitement as he and his comrades were whisked through Moscow airport and onto an American Douglas transport aircraft acquired through the Lend-Lease program. I had to stop here. It's so ironic. So Lend-Lease, clearly the Soviets were our allies in World War II, and we gave them lots of money, lots of material. It was clearly to our advantage to have Russia fighting to help stop the Nazis. But how ironic, as the war was over, by the end of April, Hitler had killed himself. He had gotten married, had all these, drug parties in his bunker, and the Nazis realized it was, the game was up for them. So now Stalin is sending his communist henchmen into Berlin to set up a communist government, but they're flying from Moscow to Berlin on an airplane made by America, given to them by Americans. It is ironic. I'm thinking back in the 80s when the U.S., we were helping the Mujahideen in Afghanistan fight against Russian occupation in the 80s. And we trained a man named Osama bin Laden, who then later was a mastermind of the 9/11 attacks. So how often we train people or other organizations, it comes back to bite us. So these German communists are flying from Moscow to Berlin to create mischief on their American Douglas airplane acquired by American taxpayers. Within minutes, the engines were fired and they were off, heading toward a city that none had visited for more than a decade. After a 90-minute flight, they landed at a military landing strip in the Carlau, far to the east of Berlin, where they were met by a small fleet of vehicles. Leonhardt was impressed. The cars carried little red flags and Soviet army signs. The chauffeurs were in Russian uniform. After a long drive to the desolate countryside, the little convoy reached the town of Bruchmühle, 20 miles east of Berlin. This was the headquarters of the political staff of Marshal Zhukov's army. Marshal Zhukov was the supreme Russian commander in World War II. And so they put these Germans up in a German guest house. Okay, Leonhardt was delighted to be back on German soil and impressed by the professionalism of the Red Army. That was the Russian army. It was somewhat disquieting, therefore, to find himself in a gloomy conversation with his new German housemaid. "You must understand," she whispered, "in the last few weeks, we've been through a terrible time." Leonhardt and his comrades assumed she'd been roughly handled by the retreating Nazis, but the truth was harder to swallow. "I didn't mean the Nazis," she stuttered. "You must realize that when the Russians arrived here, ... and thus began a terrible litany of rape, violence, and plunder." None of them believed her. Several mocked her stories, and one said she was spilling Nazi propaganda. Leonhardt alone felt she was speaking from experience. "In my heart of hearts, I reconciled myself to the fact that she really was telling the truth. If so, and if such stories extended to Berlin, then their work to win the hearts and minds of Berliners had just become a lot more complicated." On May 2nd, the group's small column of cars set out from the Bruchmühle toward Berlin, taking them through the outlying suburbs. Leonhardt was stunned by the devastation he saw. The scene was like a picture of hell. Flaming ruins and starving people shambling about in tattered clothing, dazed German soldiers who seemed to have lost all idea of what was going on, Red Army soldiers singing exultantly and often drunk. So they just comment how the devastation was so horrific. And so this Berlin group, these German communists, were put up in an unscathed building with stenographers, secretaries, and cars. Within hours of arriving, Ulbricht gave the group a detailed briefing about the work ahead. Their aim was to establish an administration in each of the city's 20 districts, one that reflected the district's political outlook. In the bourgeois quarters, that's like middle class, he said, we must appoint a bourgeois mayor. But such mayors would be nothing more than figureheads. Here's the kicker. Real power was to lie in the hands of the deputy mayor, a communist who would control all future appointments. There's a saying in English, personnel is policy. So you can have whatever policy or whatever, but the people who are in the position of power is doing things, their mindset will prevail. So the idea was have the mayor as a figurehead, the assistant mayor is a communist, and he is actually appointing people. In this way, Ulbricht's team would be able to extend its influence over all of Berlin. You'll have to find one completely reliable comrade in every district. We shall need to build up the police, said Ulbricht. Leonhardt was in no doubt they were involved in an unprecedented power grab. The goal was to build up the Communist Party, make it the most organized party, the most militant party, the most active party, and gradually take over the whole situation. This needed to be done before the British and Americans entered the city. So the idea was strike while the iron is hot and establish communism while the Russians are in control. So that is going to be the part there about the German communists coming in and taking over. So it wasn't until the end of June the Americans first began to show. Okay, so we'll stop there. Thanks for watching. More coming in part 3.